I don't remember directly talking to him about it, but those songs fit perfectly, so Solomon must have known what I was talking about this evening. And I could not have picked out better songs for pretty much the main points that I'm going to be making. If you will, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Appreciate the presence of each one of you here this evening. And I appreciate the welcome that you all have already shown to Anne-Marie and I. We've been here a few weeks now, and I already kind of feel in a groove of things with the work that's going on here. I already feel like I've been here for a while and have met most of you here. And if I have not yet met you, please find me if I do not find you first. Because although in my time here this year, I'm going to be gaining a lot of biblical knowledge, no doubt. Part of the reason why I'm here also is to grow relationships with brethren from a different part of the world. And not just here, but the blessing of getting to meet people from all over the place in this area. But I'm glad to be here with you all, and I hope that we can grow in our relationships together. I have an iPhone, an Apple product. My dad, he has a Samsung, and he has for a long time since smartphones really came out. My wife, she has a Samsung. The rest of my family, they have iPhones, and I have other friends and family members that have Apple products and Samsung products and Google products, and I don't know, maybe occasional like Motorola or Nokia. I don't know if those are very popular. Um, I don't know what Reagan's got. He's got a flip phone product. He hasn't really caught up yet. But isn't it interesting when it comes to smartphones, how sometimes we get into little arguments about them? My experience has been doing that with my dad since we first kind of got our own smartphones. I've been an Apple loyalist and he's been a Samsung loyalist. We kind of, in all good fun, go back and forth on which one is better. But sometimes we do have loyalty to our brands, don't we? And we side with one and we say this one's better or this one's better. When in reality, you think about smartphones, aren't they all about the same? Like they all kind of do the same thing. You know, they all have cameras, they all have the ability to text and call people and have access to the internet and check your email and social media and some games and stuff like that. And although the interface may be different, it sends you the information in a different way. They all pretty much have the same sort of message and information that they're giving you. They all about do the same thing. And I know that's kind of a silly modern example, but when I was reading and preparing for this lesson, that's actually something that came to my mind pretty quickly. Because as we already talked about this morning, we know a lot about the Corinthian brethren. We know a lot about the history of Corinth. And it wasn't exactly a perfect place, and it wasn't exactly a perfect church. In fact, the main messages of this book of 1 Corinthians are very much focusing on the different problems that they have, divisions that they have, addressing things brought up from Chloe's household and different questions that they have. And we only have one side of the phone conversation, but we have enough information to know they have a lot of questions. They have a lot of problems they need to work through, and some of that makes sense. Think about some of the doctrinal questions that they ask, especially in the second half of the book. Well, this was still in the time period of the early church. They were still figuring things out. They didn't have this book written for them. They needed wisdom from a guy like Paul to help guide them and lead the way. When we think about our modern day problems and divisions in our church, usually they don't really focus as much on doctrine, do they? I mean, the reason that you're here in this building right now is not because you disagree with what goes on here. You probably agree with just about everything that this church practices, and that's why you're here. Our divisions come a little bit more in the realm of people and personalities and different egos and different opinions that we might have. And I think that's a little bit more along the lines of how the book of 1 Corinthians opens up with the divisions that Paul addresses. It wasn't so much on specific doctrine as it was personalities and people, with himself being in that mix. Probably well known to you all. What were they dividing about? Well, they were attaching themselves to different early church leaders like Paul, like Apollos, like Cephas, Peter, and saying, that was my teacher. They're the best. In fact, when Paul opens up chapter 3, he's kind of continuing some of these ideas he brought up in the beginning, telling us that there's envy, there's strife, there are divisions among you. Verse 4, when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? And then verse 5, who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? What's Paul saying there? Well, he calls himself a minister, or maybe your version will say servant. You know what would be another synonym for that description? He kind of like calling himself a waiter. And think about this illustration. If you were to go into a restaurant, wouldn't it be kind of ridiculous to say, my waiter, they are the best. And then the table next to you says, no, actually, my waiter's the best. And the table across the room, no, I have the best waiter. No, that sounds pretty ridiculous, doesn't it? Why? Why is that ridiculous? Well, ultimately, doesn't all the food come from the same source? It's all cooked by the master chef. The waiter, they're just kind of the delivery people. And yes, the waiter can influence your experience there at that restaurant, but more so the reason you're there is not for the waiter, it's for the food. That's the same thing that Paul's trying to get across to them here. Yes, the messenger can have an impact, and we're going to look at that later on in the passage. It is important who it's coming from and their character and all of that. We'll talk about that. But the first and foremost point has to be the message, the food. That's what he's trying to get across from them here. It's not about me. It's not about the messengers, my fellow workers. It's about the message. And really, that's kind of the introduction and the context to this main passage we're going to be studying tonight in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 17. Oh yeah, you got to turn this on. Alrighty. Watering, working, warning. That's the title of my lesson this evening. That's how I've kind of divided up this section, verses 5 through 17. It's divided up into these three different words, but even though I've kind of sectioned it off, they kind of all overlap with each other. All pretty much the same main messages being put forward to the people, and it starts with this major point we've just been talking about. The message comes first, not just the messenger. So let's keep that in mind as we start to get into this. Let's read verses 5 through 17. Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now, he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, you are God's building. According to the grace of God which was given to me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it, but let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. The context of this whole passage leads into Paul talking about the ministry. That's really where his focus is. The message, the ministry. So starting off in this section, verses 5 through 8, I've titled Watering. We kind of already talked about the first point, verse 5, not dividing over servants or ministers, not the messengers. It's about the message. But then when you think about what verse in this passage stands out the most to you, which one immediately comes to mind, I would imagine it's probably verse 6, isn't it? I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. I want to put up a couple questions to you all, thinking about the ministry. different responsibilities that the ministry has, and ultimately how we can unify together in this ministry. What is my responsibility and what is not my responsibility? I'm going to be asking a few thought questions throughout each of these sections, some of which we will answer, some of which you'll have to answer for yourself and take home with you, and I hope that you will. So in this verse, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Paul's using an illustration that is often used in Scripture, talking about plants and fruit, something that appeals to them. So when a farmer plants, that's some work that they are doing, and someone else, maybe the farmer himself, someone else comes on and waters that plant. But ultimately, is it up to the farmer to make that plant grow? No, ultimately, all life comes from God. That's been the case since the beginning. In creation, when God breathed life into plants and animals and humankind. That's what he did. He continues to do that today. He continues to breathe into us the breath of life, and that includes the plants as well. It wasn't in Paul's power to do anything more than what he was called to do. So, when we think about this in terms of the ministry, or in terms of our role as individual Christians in trying to do the work of the ministry, we need to consider these two questions on two different levels. So, first off, we can get into trouble when we try to take God's place. When we try to do the role of God, when ours is a whole lot simpler than that. It's not our job to give the increase, it's our job to plant or to water. We're going to come back to that idea a little bit later on. Secondly, we can also get frustrated when God has called us to plant, but we're trying to water, or God has called us to water and we're trying to plant. And when I say that, what I mean is different people in this group have different roles. It's kind of what Reagan was talking about last Sunday night in his Romans 12 lesson, talking about when we live as living sacrifices, we each have different ways of doing that in order to further the work of the ministry and further the work of the church. Yet sometimes what happens is we put certain roles or positions on a pedestal. I would rather be doing that. Like, I would rather be watering, or I would rather be planting whatever work that we ourselves are not equipped to do. We sometimes idolize the different role. Like, I would rather be doing that. And then we get frustrated about our life situation or frustrated about other people who are able to do that. And God says, that's not what it's about. It's not about what your specific role is. It's about making the most of your role so that God can give the increase in the work. That is what is most important. We need to be at peace with our role and our job. And the reason why we need to do that, when you look into verse 8, now he who plants and he who waters are one. How are they the same thing? How are they one? Because ultimately, they're all going for the same thing. They're all trying to achieve the exact same goal. We're not out here going along different paths. Ultimately, our work is all going towards the same thing. That's how it should be. Towards the work of saving the lost. You know, I didn't go into this lesson intending it to be a specific evangelism sermon, although that's kind of what it's turned into based on the main points of this passage. Because when we think about what the ministry is, yes, you can talk about the local work that we do in here, but it's also in large part centered on the mission. The mission of seeking and saving the lost. That's what it should be. And we should all be going for the same thing. And so I'll have another thought question that you will have to answer yourselves. How can we further the kingdom of God with what we have been given? And each one of you will have to answer that for yourself. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, think about the parable of the talent. That's probably something that's already come into your mind. It wasn't about how many talents they got. It was about what they did with what they had. It's the same thing that God expects out of us. Do something with what you have. We're going to keep building on these ideas going forward. So watering goes right into working. All kind of the same thing. Watering, working, also synonyms for each other. So in this section, Paul gives an example of himself. Verses 9 and 10, "For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, you are God's building. According to the grace of God which was given to me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it." Okay, Paul has done a lot of work with them, hasn't he? I mean, he's writing this letter to them, trying to help them out. He's done a lot. Like a farmer planting or watering, which is the analogy he's using in the previous verses, or like a builder building, which is the analogy that he now brings out and will continue to use. He has done those things with them. He has worked with them. They are the field. They are the building. And so, in working with them, Paul has also shown them how to work with others. He has given them a blueprint for what needs to happen. You think about Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. Probably a familiar verse to a lot of us. Ephesians 2, verse 20. "Having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets." Well, that was Paul's role. That's what he was doing with them. He's shown them a blueprint for how the work is supposed to be done. And when working with a church like Corinth, you might think, man, this would be a lot of work. This would be pretty tough. Paul's had to deal with some tough people and tough situations along the way. But something else that he brings out here in this section that I think is crucial is he talks about how he views it. He talks about his attitude with the work and leaves that as an example. Did you catch that? Verse 10? "According to the grace of God, which was given to me." Isn't that a beautiful thing? Paul is saying, this is a privilege. Like, God has blessed me with the opportunity and the ability to work with you. He always gives credit back to God. It is a privilege to do this work. You know, a point that was brought up in our First Thessalonians class on Wednesday was when it comes to our physical jobs and our physical work, we oftentimes look at them like burdens. Like, this is tough. I don't really enjoy this. Not very much fun. I'm spending long hours doing all this work. And Paul says when it comes to his spiritual work, that's not it at all. It is not a burden. It is a blessing. And that's the same way we need to look at our spiritual work. It's not a burden. It is a blessing. And I hope that's how we can look at it. That's the example that he's trying to give to these Corinthian brethren. But in addition to this example that we have, he also gives them some reminders. He has to. Picking up in verse 10, "Let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear." So, for those of us that are trying to do the work and trying to follow his example, that's good. It's good that you want to do some work, but he says you got to be careful. Got to be careful how you do it. There isn't just any way to do it. There is a certain way that is laid out, and that certain way is pretty important. And, you know, I never finished that verse in Ephesians 2, verse 20, talking about the apostles and prophets. Where does it all come from? Jesus Christ himself is the chief cornerstone. Verse 11, "No other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." We don't make our own foundation for what we do. We build on his. You know, throughout these messages about watering and Paul's example and encouragement and working that we've already kind of looked at, he's made a few things evident that we've already touched on already. There are some things in our lives that we cannot control. I'm sure you know that very well. And specifically in the realm of evangelism. But there are some things we can control, right? Like Paul's already said, we can control what foundation we build on. Okay, that's a pretty obvious answer. Jesus Christ, build on him. We can control that. We can even control ourselves, our character. You notice in verse 10 how Paul says, "I am a wise master builder." Wisdom. That's a choice that he's made in his own life. He's acquired wisdom. That is his character that he has worked on throughout his life. And in the same way, We also work on our characters. We can control that. We can control what type of messenger we are being. And there are also a lot of things that we can't control when it comes to the ministry, when it comes to evangelism. And I want to talk about this for a moment because I think this is a pretty important point. It's something that I always need reminding on. For most of my life, you know how I looked at evangelism? I looked at it as bringing someone from point A to point B. Like, I'm going to meet someone, I'm going to start studying with them, like get a Bible study going. I'm going to walk them through the gospel message and the gospel story, and then they're going to believe. They're going to believe in Jesus Christ and salvation that's offered, and they're going to be baptized and start coming to church, and they're going to be a Christian, and boom. Like, that was successful. I just accomplished and did evangelism. That's how I looked at it in my life. Now, is doing all of that process, is that evangelism? Yeah, that's good work. That's success. Let me be clear, and I hope you understand this distinction. Although that process can be evangelism, evangelism does not equal that process. You see the difference, the nuance there? Biblical evangelism is a whole lot simpler than that. In its purest, most basic form, evangelism is just any good news sharing. When you talk about God, when your speech is seasoned with salt, when you mention God in your conversations and vocabulary, when you invite someone to church, doing all of those things along the way, things that we can do, just talking about God and the good things that He has done for us in our life. If you're a Christian, then you absolutely have the ability to talk about that. Has God done good things for you? Yes, He has. Tell people about it. It really is that simple. Because you know what happens when we sometimes look at it in the other lens? Is we say, I want to be evangelistic. Like, I want to do a good work. I have some zeal, I have some fervor. And then we start doing it. And to be the best evangelist we need to be, we learn some different methods of how to do it. And we read about this method that big preacher so-and-so has used to baptize 500 people, and it must be pretty successful. And so we try to do that with other people, and it doesn't work. And we think, I must just not be very good at evangelism. That was a failure. They didn't become a Christian. Here to tell you, that's the wrong mentality. That was not a failure. That was a success. People's lives are a lot like a book, except we don't always get to read the end of the book. There's going to be people that you interact with in your life, people that you talk to, people that you might be able to have an influence over. And you're going to do what you can, and they're going to leave. They're going to move out of your life, they're going to move on, and you never really saw any completion. But you know what? They're going to be those people who decades down the road have had other people water, other people work with them, and they now have come to God, and they have a relationship with Him, and you never know it. And they're going to look back on the early stages of their life and realize that you were the pivotal chapter. That conversation you had with them, that invitation to church, even though they never came, got them thinking about it. Those small things along the way, the little seeds that are planted, the little bits of watering that we can do, that is absolutely successful. We just may never see the full plant. Sometimes when you plant a seed, especially for these big trees, you never see the full tree in your lifetime. That's sometimes how it works. And that's how we need to shift our paradigm when it comes to evangelism. We plant, we water, we do what we can control, and we leave it to God for the things that we cannot control. And I think taking that mindset will help us to be better evangelists. I hope it will be. But that is not to say that there is nothing important about the messenger. That is something that we need to work on. There is some importance to that. I mean, that's kind of what he next talks about. Verse 12, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear. The day will declare it. It's up to us to determine the quality of what we build. He offers a pair of contrasts here. You have gold, silver, precious stones. Then you have wood, hay, and straw. Two very different qualities in this verse. We have to ask ourselves if what we're trying to build is worthy. Worthy of what? Well, worthy of the foundation. Jesus Christ is the foundation. That's a pretty high standard to live up to. That's what we're called to do in our lives. Be worthy. Be holy. Be precious. But what exactly is it talking about, though? This work that we're doing, this quality? Well, we got to remember the metaphor that we're kind of looking at. If Jesus has established the foundation of the kingdom and of the church, then aren't the materials that make it up, aren't they the people? Right? So we think about it in terms of us. Like, what kind of quality is my life? That's something I need to consider. Is my life a high quality or is it not? Okay? Each one of you has to answer that. But that question is furthered beyond just us as well. Let's get into this last section. It says warning, because there are some consequences with the whole ministry. There's already been some consequences that he's mentioned up to this point. He says, our work is going to be tested and judged. There is going to be a refining fire that is going to burn, and only the precious and valuable materials are going to be saved. He uses fire a lot here in these last few verses. When it talks about the work that we're doing, when you read that word here in these verses, what exactly is he talking about, do you think? A lot of people will look at this and automatically think, well, he's talking about the teaching that you do, like the doctrine and your message. I want you to fit that here into these verses. Each one's doctrine or teaching will become clear, for the day will declare it. It will be revealed by fire. The fire will test each one's doctrine of what sort it is. If anyone's doctrine or teaching which he has done and built on it endures, he will receive a reward. But if anyone's teaching or doctrine is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So if the message that you're teaching, if it's not any good, if it burns up because it's false teaching and of a terrible quality, you're still going to be saved. Okay, now that doesn't really make much sense in the context of these verses. What is the work he's talking about? Look a page or two over in your Bibles to chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 1. He says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? You. These brethren, these people that he's talking to, the work that he's referring to here is the people he has taught. The people taught are the work. And when you try to put that into these verses, that makes a whole lot more sense. You know, this work, these Corinthian brethren, for example, that he's been working with, it's up to them to determine whether or not they are saved. Isn't it? Now, Paul, he can do a lot of good work. He can be faithful in his life, and if he is, then he'll be saved. But ultimately, it's up to them whether or not they are saved. You can't ride someone else's coattails up to heaven. You can't say, I am of Paul, and expect that to be your ticket punch. No, we have to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. So there is a warning in that right there. Take heed, listen, do the good work. But he also here in this section talks about a reward. Verse 14. What's the reward that he's talking about? I'll offer this to you. Look briefly with me at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Just mention these verses, and we'll get into this in our Wednesday night class as well. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. For what is our hope or joy or crown of rejoicing? Is it not even you in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ that is coming? For you are our glory and joy. And that makes a whole lot of sense in the context of who these Thessalonian brethren were. They had been doing a lot of good work. You look at these brethren and think, yeah, they're on the right track to heaven. And Paul is joyful. He rejoices with what they've been able to do and accomplish and the work that he's been able to do with them that's culminated with their character. And haven't you seen the same thing in your life when you have been able to bring someone to God? There is a reward. There is a joy that comes along with that. Absolutely. But then we also have to remember the other side of the coin in which our reward may not be as immediate as we want it to be. Sometimes our reward comes way on down the road, and sometimes we only may know it maybe when we're up in heaven with God and with everyone else. That's why we also have to take joy in the journey. How it's not just about the result. It's about the privilege it is to plant and to water and to do our role, even when we don't always see the increase. So with that in mind, when we think about teaching, when we think about how important it is, we think about the reward that can come with people being built up into this kingdom. Here's another thought question for you, kind of the last one that I want you to leave with. How do we maximize our time and effort to be the best messengers we can be? When we think about the world that we're living in right now, we think about this area that we're in, think about the Silicon Valley with 1, 2 million, however many people are in this area, the hustle and bustle and crowded space we're in. How can we as a group maximize our time to help people come into God's kingdom and to refine it? To have people be precious stones. That's something that we consider as a congregation, something we're continuing to think about and talk about, and always looking for new ways to do that and to be successful. But I would encourage you, never stop thinking about it. Throughout your life, as the times change, never stop thinking about how can I be most effective for the kingdom, because this is important. In this passage, it ends out with both a warning, but also a hopeful encouragement. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Now that verse 16 there, do you know that you are the temple? That's a plural you. Still talking about the people, the church, the kingdom. You are this temple. That temple better be holy. You think about the Old Testament temple, what happens when you defile that? You get the death sentence. He says, this New Age temple, it has to be holy as well. Because those fires are going to burn, and only the precious and valuable materials are going to last. So we consider that for our lives, and we try to consider that for the lives of everyone around us. So there is the warning there, but also the hopeful encouragement that this group here can be a beautiful and precious part of God's holy temple. And that's what I want us to think about. That's how we should view ourselves. It's getting to be a part of this holy, beautiful kingdom. And so, together as a group, we seek to unify ourselves. Unify together as a church, not under man, but under God and the foundation that His Son has established. And when we unify together, when we use our roles, the talents that we've been given to further the work of the ministry, beautiful things can happen. We can accomplish the work of reaching out to lost souls, of planting and watering, of doing what we can. The work we do, we need to focus on it being as pure and strong as we can possibly make it for our lives and in the lives of the people that we're teaching. And what joy it can be when we can bring others to the Lord, when we can plant the seed and further refine the beautiful temple of God's kingdom. If you're here this evening and you're not a part of that temple, God has set forth an invitation. Come be gold. Come be a precious stone. It's a choice that you have to make. And no message of mine, no eloquent speaker, no anyone who gets up here can make that decision for you. It has to be yours from your own heart. But then there also might be people here who consider themselves part of God's kingdom, but the quality of your life may be more wood, hay, or straw than it is gold right now. And if you need to make changes in your life, if you need to be refined, and if we can help you do that in any way, I invite you to let it be known and come forward as we stand, as we sing.